Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me okay? Excellent, excellent. So I want to welcome you to the Cass Corridor Commons. My name is Craig Register, and I'm just going to say a few words of welcome. And if you're kind of outside the circle, we'd love to welcome you inside the circle. If you want to chill in the back, that's okay too. We have more chairs we can bring out. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to welcome all of you. The fan will not be turned on because it's really loud. So if you're wondering why it's sitting over there not on, because it's loud as hell. And unless it gets really hot, we're probably going to leave it off. So just keep that in mind. I just wanted to say a few things about the series that's kicking off tonight, our summer series, Detroiters Speak, Summertime Edition, Beyond 67, the Citywide Citizens Action Committee. How many of you wonder what that is, the Citywide Citizen Actions Committee? Raise your hand high. Okay, so about half the room, great. So I imagine we're going to learn about that, and David's going to tell you more about that, as well as our speakers. I don't know that much about it, so I'm not going to try and explain it. This is a series that we've been doing now for about 5 years in this model, and I just want to say a few words about it. Detroiters Speak is a mini course that emerged out of, and now I feel like I'm screaming. Nick, am I too loud? No, okay. This is really a unique community classroom that the Semester in Detroit program at the University of Michigan sort of launched several years ago. Lolita Hernandez, who's one of our amazing team members, not here this evening, was really one of the main initiators of this idea. And the main idea is pretty simple. It's that we're all students of life, students for life, right? At some level, so we're lifelong learners. We all hopefully have a sense of that. Even after you've stopped paying tuition or you graduated from high school or what have you, there's much to be learned. And so these are community classrooms. And so we bring together, if you look around the room, you're going to get a sense of, there's some young people, absolutely. Raise your hand if you're an actual U of M tuition-paying student. Okay, so you see there's about half the room, maybe a little bit more. And I believe we have our friends from the Detroit Community-Based Research Program, mostly over here, yeah. And then we have the smaller representation of Semester in Detroit over here, but also over there. And so we're not going to do a tug of war tonight, but these are two different programs where students are living, learning, taking classes, interning in the city of Detroit for the semester. And we're sister programs, and so we're happy that you all came and joined us tonight. But again, the main idea behind Detroiters Speak is to have a shared classroom space with everyday people, everyday learners in Detroit, Ypsi, Ann Arbor, the metro area, our own students, to have a little food. It's not going to be gourmet, but we always have something. And for everybody to feel like we can acknowledge and honor that everybody has a range of experiences and stories and perspectives. Some of us have been on this earth longer than others, and that's great. But we want to make sure after tonight you invite other people too. So we've had class sessions with 150 people. We've had some with 20. We always have interesting conversations regardless of how many people are here. And so welcome to Detroiters Speak, and we're happy that you're here tonight. I want to say two other things. One, about the space. Who's in this space for the first time? Raise your hand if you've never been in this room or this building before. Okay. So you're in the Cass Corridor Commons, otherwise known as the First Unitarian Universalist Church, which as you came in over there, you saw the church. This is the Socialist McAllister Hall. This is a really historic building in many ways. This particular hall is very historic also. There have been many hundreds, perhaps thousands, of meetings somewhat like this over the decades in the 20th century and into the 21st century about what the hell is going on in the world and how we should impact the world and change it for the better. That's a very broad way to describe it, but I can assure you there have been meeting after workshop after session in this space. And so it's always important to honor and acknowledge that, I think, that we're in a space where there have been many people thinking, working, talking about being active and engaged in the world, making a difference in the world, broadly defined in all sorts of different ways. So this is a real social justice space. Historically in Detroit, it's a very important space. And EMEAC, if you look back at the back of the wall over there, EMEAC, East Michigan Environmental Action Council, they are pretty much the fiduciary, if you know what that means, the main sort of social enterprise organization that runs this space, which is not cheap to run this very old building. There are many other organizations on the second floor that are involved in active environmental justice struggles and other work around the city of Detroit, politically and otherwise. And so this is the space you're in. Welcome to the Cass Corridor Commons. And please look up more information about this space and how you can get involved and what happens here. Lastly, I want to introduce the main organizer of the series and a recently become a better friend of mine, I shouldn't say better friend of mine, friend of mine, who was an acquaintance a couple years ago and is now becoming a friend, is what I meant to say, and I'm really happy to work with David. David Goldberg has his own self-title for his role within Semester in Detroit, which I will let him unveil when he would like to do that. He's a professor in African American Studies at Wayne State University. He's been teaching at Wayne for 10 plus years. And we are so happy this summer to have been able to have David work for U of M's Semester in Detroit program to put together this series. And I probably didn't mention this, this is the first of 4 Thursday nights at 6, right? And so the first of 4 consecutive Thursday nights, so I hope you come to all the sessions. We do record them to put on our website and to put up on YouTube and the other tubes for people to see who can't be here. And so when we do that discussion and dialogue, just so you know, we don't roam around with the camera and like zoom in on your face. We just get the audio. So the camera will stay faced over here to our speakers. So I think without further ado, I'm going to say thank you again for being here and turn it over to Professor David Goldberg.
Yeah, I gave myself a title because they weren't going to give me one, so I figured I'd be the H. Rat Brown Professor of Urban Guerrilla Warfare at University of Michigan. So I hold that title near and dear to my heart, and I'm proud to serve as the H. Rat Brown Professor of Urban Guerrilla Warfare at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is, as they mentioned, this is an important space. And I mentioned this for a couple of reasons. This space has come under attack in many ways recently. Like all commons, areas meant for the public, it's actively being sought to be privatized. So when you get calls, and we hear calls to contribute, to raise funds, so we can still meet and have discussions like this, this is a very kind of important and sacred space in Detroit, and I hope we all remember that and we protect it. And I bring that up because protecting spaces is kind of what CSAC was formed for. CSAC, the original organization, was formed in the wake of the 1967 rebellion. There was a big meeting, public meeting, and the city leaders thought that they knew the black people that they had to talk to in order to straighten things out in the community. It turns out they had the wrong people. And when this community meeting was called, all of a sudden a new group of leadership, it wasn't new, but it was new to white people, but it had been active in the black community for years, and they rose to prominence in the wake of the rebellion. In fact, the leader of CSAC was Reverend Clegg of Shrine of the Black Madonna, what later became Shrine of the Black Madonna. And the vice president of the organization was a gentleman by the name of Glenn Dowdell, who was an active member of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and had been involved in the Revolutionary Action Movement in Detroit. So it gives you an idea of kind of, the foment that was developing in the wake of the rebellion and the politics that evolved in that space. And one of the things that people were really trying to do in the wake of the rebellion was to prevent the onslaught of kind of what had become urban renewal, which in many ways is analogous to people used to refer to it, as you all know, as Negro removal, but it's analogous in many ways to kind of the process of gentrification that's taking place today. So I thought, by hearkening back to the name, Citizen CSAC, it was kind of timely because we're facing many of the same issues today, even in a much different era. So that's why I gave it the title, and if you guys get a chance to look up that organization, feel free to Google it and learn more about it and just how big and widespread and important that organization was. I want to get out of the way because I'm hot and I'm sweating. But we have 3 wonderful speakers for you tonight. I have like full-length bios, and I'm not going to read them because I've been asked not to. For some of them, we have Danielle McGuire, who's a colleague of mine from Wayne State University. I'm going to give a little bit of it. She's the author of At the Dark End of the Street. If you haven't read this book, you should. It's a really trailblazing book. award-winning Black Women, Rape and Resistance, a New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power, which won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians and the Lillian Smith Book Award. She's an associate professor of history emerita now, and teaches. She's a wonderful colleague and friend, and I'm glad she's here. I also have FL, who's next to her, fearless leader, Melba Joyce Boyd, a distinguished professor. Well, that's annually looked at now, right?
No.
Oh, no, she's distinguished.
Just the money.
She's distinguished and will remain that way. In my book, I call her fearless leader because she was the longtime chair of our department and held the administration at bay effectively for a number of years, and that took quite a lot of work. And last but not least, we have Ron Glotta. And Ron, if you'd come up, just sit right here. I'll tell you a little bit about Ron. Ron is an attorney and a partner in Glotta and Associates, which has over 100 clients, most of whom are decent, hard-working people trying to stay alive.
All of them.
All of them. It said almost, so I didn't want to misquote.
All right.
He defines himself as an attorney who believes in the militant representation of workers against the ravages of capitalism, and for 5 decades has, quote, honed his expertise in the areas of workers' compensation law and social security law. Mr. Glotta earned a JD from the University of Michigan in 1966 and received a BA from the University of Kansas prior. He has earned distinction as an AV Preeminent attorney, is recognized by Martindale-Hubbell, and is a member of the Michigan Association for Justice. He is also the author of The Road to Hell is Not Paved with Good Intention, and his website, glottaassociates.com, features his writings, articles in which he's featured in, and audio commentaries. So I'm going to turn this over. I'm going to give you an idea how we're going to start. I'm a historian by the way that I think, so chronologically is how I normally go about this. So I figure we'll start with Danielle, Melba, and then Ron, if that's okay.
That's nice, because I'm the oldest one.
There you go. So we'll do it like that too.
I like that one.
So please welcome everybody, Danielle McGuire.
Quick question, should I try the fan or not? No, okay. Then I won't.
So if it's okay, I'm just going to sit here because I have these slides. Let me just do it. Oh, there's a timeout. It was naughty. Sometimes I have to do this. Okay. It's been nearly 50 years since the flames of rage and frustration consumed 100 blocks of Detroit. In just one terrifying week in July 1967, 43 people died, 7,000 individuals, mostly young African-American men, were arrested. Nearly 20,000 armed policemen, National Guardsmen, and paratroopers patrolled the streets, and hundreds of businesses smoldered as citizens' hopes lay shattered amidst the broken glass. During all that, the slow and steady march of tanks imposed order with frightening clarity. In an effort to understand what caused the uprising in Detroit and several other cities in the tumultuous 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson convened the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, we might know it as the Kerner Commission, which argued that it was a long history of racial oppression, of police brutality, of economic inequality that lay at the heart of the unrest. Almost invariably, the final report said, the incident that ignites disorder arises from police action. So while scholars studying urban crises over the past half-century have focused on understanding the macro causes and concerns and consequences of major disorders and the aftermath of disaster, I think few have investigated the ways in which ordinary people experience this racial cataclysm, particularly the long and devastating history of police violence, which the riot brought to national attention. So I'm writing a new book. In the past, I'd focused on civil rights in the South. And of course, when I moved to Detroit, I thought there's no better place to study civil rights and racial justice than Detroit. And so I'm really looking at a single incident that happened during a single week in that single year in 1967 to illustrate the ways in which a major American crisis and the violence within it reverberates long after the initial event. So I'm talking about the Algiers Motel murders in 1967. So in the early morning hours of July 26, 1967, a flurry of Detroit policemen, National Guardsmen, and state police officers rushed to the Algiers Motel after hearing reports of what they thought was sniper fire nearby. It was the third night of the Detroit Rebellion, and there were steady reports of this sniper fire that police responded to. Though in almost every city that experienced an uprising or rebellion, nearly all of the gunfire came from police, guardsmen, and other officials, not actual snipers. Nonetheless, police rushed to the Algiers Motel in the Virginia Park neighborhood of central Detroit, just up the street. It was, at the time, I think, what people would call a relatively seedy place. John Hershey called it a transient hotel with a reputation among police as a site for narcotics and prostitution. But it was more than that. It was also a hangout for soul acts that were in town, and they'd go there afterwards to have after parties, and it was a cool place to be seen and to see others. And because of the uprising and citywide curfew that night, there were all kinds of people who sought refuge there, including a returning Vietnam veteran named Robert Preeminent, and friends and members of a doo-wop group known as the Dramatics, who had just played a gig down at the Fox Theater. National Guard Warrant Officer Theodore Thomas was also there, Private Guard Melvin Dismukes, a private security guard that was stationed across the street, and 3 junior Detroit police officers, Ronald August, Robert Paley, and David Senek. Those 5 would all play a central role in what one witness later called a night of horror and murder. So like I said, just past midnight, police and soldiers arrived at the Algiers. They tore through its tattered halls and rundown rooms with shotguns. They ransacked closets and drawers, turned beds and tables over, shot into walls and closets, and they beat guests with their rifle butts in a desperate and vicious effort to find what they called the sniper. When they completed this search without finding any weapons, they ordered all the guests to line up in the first floor lobby. One of the young men that night was 17-year-old Carl Cooper. He was on his way downstairs when he was met by police who had just stormed into the building, and they accused him of being the sniper. According to a witness, Cooper said, "Man, I didn't shoot anything. I don't have a weapon. Take me to jail." Just before they heard the fatal shots that fell Carl Cooper. Police then herded the other guests down into the lobby, 7 young African-American men and 2 white women who were all forced to walk past Cooper's bloody corpse as it lay near the east wall. And they were told to stand along that wall with their hands over their heads. And this was the beginning of what John Hershey would call in his 1968 book, The Algiers Motel Incident, what he called the death game. The details of what exactly happened next are complicated, convoluted, I think lost to the chaos of time and memory, the disparate recollections of the survivors, especially those who were traumatized by the terror that night. But I think this is the gist of what we know. The Detroit police officers, David Senek, Robert Paley, and Ronald August, were seemingly in charge of interrogating this group. They wanted to know who had the gun, which one of them was the sniper, and who was doing all that shooting. They all denied having a gun. They all denied doing any shooting. Nonetheless, officers began to brutally beat them with their fists, with their pistols, with their rifle butts, leaving gashes and knots on the victims' heads and on their backs. One witness testified later that a police officer struck one of the boys so hard that it, quote, staggered him and sent him to his knees. The violence that night was not only racialized, it was sexualized. A military policeman, part of the contingent of National Guardsmen and paratroopers at the scene, testified later that, quote, a Detroit policeman stuck a shotgun between the legs of one of the men and threatened to blow his testicles off. Karen Malloy and Julie Heisel, the two white women who were there that night, who were prostitutes, testified that policemen tore off their dresses, pushed their faces against the wall, and smashed their guns into the backs of the girls. Karen Malloy later testified that police called her and Heisel, quote, all sorts of vulgar things, including N lovers and white N's. According to one witness, it was DPD officer David Sennick who pulled down one of the girls' dresses and said, and I quote, why you gotta fuck them? What's wrong with us? Another witness heard a policeman say, we're gonna get rid of all you pimps and whores. And then one by one, police pulled the unarmed men into different rooms, brutally beat them and interrogated them at gunpoint to force a confession. Roderick Davis, who was a member of the Dramatics, testified that it was Sennick who took him into a room, forced him to the ground, and shot him to the floor and said, I'll kill you if you move. Then Sennick came into the lobby and asked the warrant officer from the National Guard, Theodore Thomas, if he too wanted to shoot one. They pulled Michael Clark out of the line, took him into a separate room, roughed him up, pushed him down to the ground, and then fired into the ceiling and told him to be quiet and stay put. Then Sennick returned to the lobby and, according to everyone else there, handed DPD officer Ronald August a gun and said, your turn. Now comes the tragic part, August wrote in his confession 5 days later, where with the help of DPOA attorney Norman Lippett, he described the circumstances under which he killed Aubrey Pollard, who was 19 years old. Of course, he claimed that Pollard lunged at him, that he had no choice but to defend himself by fatally shooting this young man. But that confession was at least the second one he had given. The first one he wrote without an attorney present, didn't mention anything about self-defense. That part came later. Even the director of the FBI, that model of fairness and happiness, J. Edgar Hoover, read the official statements of the police, and he wrote back to the director in Detroit, and he said that their statements are, quote, for the most part untrue, and were undoubtedly furnished in an effort to cover their activities in the true series of events. So by the time the police finally left the Algiers motel about an hour after they arrived, 3 young men, Carl Cooper, Aubrey Pollard, and Fred Temple, had been killed, their bodies abandoned and discarded as casualties of the riot. The policemen who stole these young men's lives did not file a report, did not tell their superiors they were at the Algiers, and did not notify the victims' families. When homicide detectives finally arrived a few hours later, their initial report, sort of the first draft of history, said that these 3 young men had, quote, apparently been shot to death in an exchange of gunfire. The Detroit News reported on the deaths the next morning, and they said essentially the same thing, except they added, the roof and windows on all floors of the Algiers kept the police and guardsmen pinned down for several minutes before the gunfight stopped. Now that story didn't feel right to many observers, especially the witnesses who were there and knew that that's not what happened. But also, there were 3 reporters from the Detroit Free Press who wondered why, if there was a gunfight, there were no guns on the premises. Why were no guns found there? And why, if there was a gunfight with police firing from the outside in, all of the bullet holes were on the inside of the motel, not on the outside? I mean, simple questions, right? So when the autopsies were finished, the Wayne County Medical Examiner reported that each victim had been shot by a 12-gauge shotgun at close range in non-defensive postures, and witnesses told just about anyone who would listen that the police committed straight-up murder. Now, it was this testimony from witnesses that compelled Congressman John Conyers to notify the Justice Department. He knew that their pleas for help and reports of police wrongdoing would go nowhere within the system, that there had been similar complaints and concerns for years and years, and he knew no one was going to do anything. He notified John Doerr in the Justice Department, and John Doerr had been working on civil rights throughout the country, and he demanded an FBI investigation. And because of those efforts, really because of the push by Congressman Conyers, 4 officers were finally charged with the murders or of violating the civil rights of Pollard, Temple, and Cooper. The fact that they had been charged, or at least rounded up and questioned, worried a lot of people, not because they had been charged, but because they figured that this would be a whitewash, right? That they would never really face any kind of punishment. And so this set off a major campaign within the Black community for justice and for a continuing demand for an end to police brutality. But because so many people had been berated and stopped and frisked and jostled and beaten up and roughed up and railroaded by the police, no one actually believed justice was possible. In fact, distrust of the judicial system ran so deep that local Black activists, what David was talking about earlier, held what was called a People's Tribunal 1 month after the shootings at Reverend Albert Clegg's Shrine in the Black Madonna, where ordinary people tried the officers for murder. There were lots of people there that day, thousands in fact, and on the jury, which was culled from local activists and people who were in the community, sat none other than Rosa Parks, which I really found interesting, but not really, because her own experiences had been long, and she had become a warrior for racial justice in the 1940s, a decade at least before the Montgomery bus boycott. She was particularly interested in incidences of racial violence and sexualized racial violence, and she had been working on rape cases in Alabama for years, and so it made sense to put her there. And so it's not a surprise either that the People's Tribunal found those officers guilty of murder and indicted the systematic abuse of Black citizens by police and jurists in Detroit. Besides that, there were at least 2 quote-unquote real trials, both of which were moved out of Detroit, of course, to all-white towns where they had all-white juries. Both trials, one in 1968 for murder, and that was Ronald August who was charged, and the other for conspiracy to deny the victims civil rights 2 years later in Flint, ended in acquittals. Fred Temple's mother, who had watched the proceedings with growing hopelessness, said that the jury's decision was, quote, just the latest phase of a step-by-step whitewash of a police slaying. Senator Coleman Young, who would go on to, of course, be the future mayor of Detroit, said that the decision in the murder trial and in the federal civil rights case demonstrates, quote, once again, that law and order is a one-way street. He said, there is no law and order where Black people are involved, especially where they're involved with the police. So no one was ever held accountable for the murder of Fred Temple and Carl Cooper and Aubrey Pollard. And while the mothers of Temple and Pollard both received out-of-court settlements from the city, a trend that we see continuing around the country, that money could never replace justice. It could never, ever replace their sons. The violence wasn't limited to one night. And so while 3 young men had their lives snatched away, the survivors and family members had to live with the memory of that violence and the police harassment that followed those families for years. Indeed, for many of the witnesses and their family and friends, that violence reverberated for decades. I think the story that Algiers Motel captures in its tragic horror, the often hidden and then often deniable, to some, infrastructure of northern racism and white supremacy. While police harassment and violence may have served as the spark that ignited the riot, the rebellion in 1967, the truth is that the entire system was rotten. From rabbit housing and job discrimination to racialized and sexualized violence to the everyday injustices and unequal sentencing in the courts and judicial system, inequality and segregation in the model city was every bit as virulent as it was in the South. Maybe it was worse. Because this is a new project for me, I think I'll just end with a few questions that we can talk about together, and I look forward to hearing your ideas. So one of the things I'm trying to do is use a single event to understand a complex story, and there's so many threads to pull. The police violence at the Algiers, while extreme, was not an anomaly. For example, one of the officers involved, David Senek, killed at least 2 other men that week alone. Joseph Chandler on Tuesday the 24th, and Palmer Gray on Friday of that week. Just that week, 3 people. And he was involved with 3 deaths at the Algiers. Both times he claimed self-defense. He said they had knives, and of course nothing further happened. Interestingly, though, the lawyer for the DPOA told me on tape that the police kept a box of pearl-handled knives in their office and planted them on any victims they shot or killed. And that every time the police shot someone, which he said was nearly every day in those years, the police claimed self-defense. The attorney told me he just would get called into the office, the DPD office in the middle of the night after a shooting, and would push them aside at the typewriter, and that he wrote their preliminary complaint reports. And then he would say, and they lunged at you, right? And you feared for your life, right? And he said, and I quote, "I didn't put words in their mouth, but I knew they were going to lie anyway." Additionally, in the months and years preceding the uprising, there were a number of horrific police beatings and killings that I think we should investigate. Particularly worthy of inquiry is the large number of sex workers who were beaten and killed by Detroit police officers. Police who were working on vice squads and then later stress teams were notoriously brutal. Senek was one of those vice squad members. And they were particularly brutal in their interactions with black women, some of whom worked as prostitutes, some of whom didn't. So I'm wondering, how does gender operate in the use of police violence? How does racism and sexism function together? And 2, how do we really calculate the cost of police violence when we think about these settlements then and now? How can we quantify the abuse, the harassment, the street corner stop and frisk, the constant surveillance, and what that does to a person? Each of the victims and witnesses and their family members told a history of everyday police harassment and abuse both before and after the Algiers incident. What happens to people who are treated like stray dogs and worse every single day? 3, how does testimony function in the aftermath of violence? Whose testimony has credibility? Whose story becomes the established truth? Think about that first draft of history that the homicide detectives put down in the report, and then the Detroit News followed. And where is truth located? In the community, in the history books, in the system? Which stories are amplified? Which stories are buried? Which stories are largely invisible? And what does invisibility do over time? So I often drive past the site of the Algiers Motel, and its invisibility strikes me as stark. And I think that's an important question. 4, I think we're doing this, but I think we need to continue to create an archive of police violence and harassment and brutality. We have the makings of a huge archive, unfortunately, from the grainy, beatings of LAPD and Rodney King, to the recording of Eric Garner begging for air, to the latest Philandro Castile video. There are endless images of this kinds of violence. It's pornographic, in a way. But what about the history? We don't have an archive of that history. I think we need to pull it together. And then what happens to the survivors of violence? One of the things when we talk about 67, everyone always says, well, there were 43 dead, many injured, but there were people who were shot and lost the use of their legs, their arms. They changed their lives forever. The mother of Tanya Blanding, the 4-year-old girl who was mowed down by machine gun fire in her apartment, had her arm severed by that machine gun fire. What happens to the survivors of violence? Because the trauma doesn't end when the crime is solved or the victim is buried. I think that violence reverberates. And so we need to look at the physical, the emotional, the psychological scars that remain. Aubrey Pollard Sr. told John Hershey, he said, "I lost a son. I lost a son." There's a magnitude in that simplicity. But he lost more than that. His marriage fell apart after the police killed his son. He became separated from his other children. They lost daily interactions with their father. That family unit was destroyed. Mr. Pollard's oldest son, a soldier in Vietnam, returned from the battlefield to identify his brother at the coroner's office and basically had a nervous breakdown. he went to a mental hospital. Mrs. Pollard tried to carry on the best she could, but her life was forever changed. In a 1967 interview, she focused on her son Aubrey's art and how talented he was, mentioning over and over again that he won a prize for painting a boat. There's lost opportunity, lost talent, a lost future, a lost sense of humanity and citizenship because she knew the system was corrupt. She knew that there would be no justice. And so the loss just echoes. It multiplies, it mutates, it reemerges. If we pull these threads, if we ask these questions of even a single event during a single terrible week, perhaps we can get closer to what historian Mel Painter called a fully loaded cost accounting of white supremacy and racism. At the very least, I think, understanding the ways racism and sexism functioned in tandem to maintain power and control in the past can give us some tools for how to destroy it today. Thanks.
Thank you, Danielle. I just wanted to mention that this kind of segues directly into our next speaker, fearless leader Melba Joyce Boyd, who had a family member who was killed by stress, which was a unit of the police, extra-legal force that developed in response to the Detroit Rebellion. And so we see this too, is that the response to an act like we saw at the Algiers motel was more repression, more violence, and it stepped up even greater in the years ahead and destroyed families, but it was contested, and I think that's the important part. I mean, Melba in many ways is who she is today because she was always a fighter before stress was ever formed, but also in response to it. So she has a piece that's in, what is the title of the book?
This is the book,
Oh, yeah.
Detroit 1967, which also Danielle
Yes.
was reading from.
Joel Stone's Detroit 1967, and both Danielle and Melba have pieces in here. And Melba's chapter is entitled "The Problem Was the Police."
Okay, thank you, David. By the way, no one calls me FL but David, okay, so let's keep that in the mood. This collection, which actually Danielle just was basically reading from her piece, the beginning of a new research project for her. I also have a chapter in here which deals actually in some ways. I'm trying to sign this out. And this actually comes before 67, because I think in terms, and to be able to understand how pervasive and how vicious the police were with regards to black citizens in Detroit, I wanted to tell the story of my stepfather and what happened to him. And the reason I did that was because it's personal, but also, as I indicate in the piece, it was pervasive. So he's not the only one that this is happening to. The police. It's always the police. If you were black and living in pre-Coleman Young Detroit, you never called the police for help because they only made matters worse. Besides, the neighborhoods where I grew up had the lowest crime rates in the city. We left our doors unlocked, and in the summer, sometimes we step outside for the fun of it. When I was in kindergarten, Officer Wilson, who was white, visited our classroom to teach us how to safely cross the street. He brought puppets to amuse us, to capture our attention while teaching us about safety, how to cross the street, not to take candy from strangers, and so on. He also appeared before and after school, conducting traffic on 4th Street and Visca Road the corner where Boynton Elementary School is located. We were 5 years old, trusting of adults and heroic myths about the police. After Officer Wilson's visit, many of the boys in the class would say they wanted to be a policeman or a fireman when they grew up. 10 years later, our innocence in that illusion was shattered when some other cops slapped those same kids upside the head for reckless eyeballing during an unfortunate encounter with the Big Four. These were acts of intimidation to precondition young black men to fear the police and to fear the power of whiteness. This systemic repression was a precursor to much more dangerous and horrific encounters. I often wondered what Officer Wilson would do about these interactions when those same cute little brown kindergartners he used to protect were being abused by his fellow officers. Almost everyone had a story that reverberated as warnings, like the time my stepfather, Siegel Glotta II, flagged down a patrol car after another motorist rear-ended his new red Plymouth Fury station wagon at a stoplight on Schaefer Road, which should have been a simple matter of listening and writing a traffic ticket at the scene of the accident transformed into an ugly abuse of power. As my father was explaining what had obviously transpired, one of the cops turned to the white motorist and said, "Go on, we'll handle this." The second cop grabbed my father from behind and cuffed him. What ensued was shocking, but not unusual. In the dark of night, the second cop held Siegel from behind while his partner brutally beat him. However, my stepfather realized an opportunity to counter the assault when the cop's head came too close after landing a blow. He caught the cop's ear between his teeth, bore down and bit off the earlobe, then spat it into the street. The main cop screamed in pain and scrambled to retrieve the bloody scrap from the asphalt. The other cop shoved my father into the back of the police car and drove his partner to the hospital and my father to the police station. He was not locked in a cell. Instead, they chained him to a chair in the basement of the precinct, where any cop who had the urge used him as a punching bag. At the time, my father was a strong, healthy man of 47 years, and he survived the attack and the aftermath at the police station. But subsequently, he was arraigned and charged with resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. He was found guilty of those charges, but his sentence was suspended after the judge saw photos of my father, bruised and swollen. Or perhaps the judge concluded that sending a college-educated, tax-paying citizen with no criminal record to prison was senseless. Or perhaps he thought locking up a decorated World War II veteran who had a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart might be unpatriotic. Unfortunately, he didn't think that perhaps the right thing to do would be to charge the police officers with assault and battery and get them off the police force and the streets of Detroit. But it was 1965, and there was no Michigan Civil Rights Commission or Detroit Police Commission or Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality to investigate instances that violated the citizens' constitutional rights, as was the case for many others. Ron Scott recounted a horrifying encounter with Detroit police to Kim Hunter for his article, 1967, Detroiters Remember the Rebellion. Ron said, "We did not feel the civil rights movement had a particular focus on the issues that we faced. In Detroit, that was the police. 7 years before the disturbance, Mayor Mariani had a crackdown in the black community. I was 12 years old, and a cop put a shotgun in my face and told me not to breathe." In 1968, Scott joined the Detroit chapter of the Black Panther Party and the League of Revolutionary Workers, and in the subsequent decades, led the struggle through his organization, the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality. So when the news reported that there was a disturbance after a confrontation between the police and some Negroes at a Blind Pig, an after-hours establishment on 12th Street, I was not surprised. Neither were most of the black people in Detroit. It was a cumulative response to police brutality, the straw that broke the camel's black back, and people were sick of it, sick of the police. Ed Vaughn, who was known in the community because of Vaughn's bookstore and who subsequently served in Comignon's administration as a state representative, also blamed the Detroit Police Department in his comments to Kim Hunter. Quote, "The undercurrent of discontent was always there. We, the grassroots community leaders, were trying to tell them, the white power structure, that the police department was an army of occupation. People were being beaten, even killed. The Algiers Motel incident, one of the most shocking examples of police murders, happened during the 1967 rebellion. Carl Gregory, a community activist and a professor at Wayne State at the time, described his encounter with the National Guard in July 1967 during an oral history session with the Detroit Historical Society. It occurred on the east side of Detroit when he was patrolling the streets with Alvin Harrison, trying to get people to return to their homes during the civil eruption. We continued until late that evening during a curfew. The National Guard stopped us. There was a young white guardsman who dismounted from his vehicle, approached and told me, "Pull your window down." I was driving. He pointed his gun at me. I was concerned, but I wasn't afraid then. His hand was shaking on the trigger, and I said, "Look, I'm a college professor. I'm just trying to get the people off the street." And he looked like he was trying to determine whether or not I was a writer or what have you. And a sergeant came by and said something like, "Cool it." But this guardsman, this kid, was more afraid of me than I was of him. I don't know how many black persons, if any, that youth had been in contact before in his entire life. My family didn't live near the site of any of the civil eruptions, so I watched it on the television. In 1965, it was the Los Angeles community riots that exploded and was broadcast on the national news. LA was far away, and at the time, Detroit was regarded as a model city. Despite declining jobs and automobile plants, unemployment was low. Therefore, the Detroit politicians were taken by surprise when anger and despair added their city to the growing list of racially torn cities. Vietnam was the war we were concerned about at the time because my oldest brother was in the Marine Corps and stationed in Vietnam. Our familiar anxiety came from Danielle's military situation, and we watched the news religiously as we might catch a glimpse of him on the screen or hear a report about his unit. Suddenly, we were watching imagery of the Vietnam War juxtaposed with similar scenes of conflict on 12th Street, which became even more bizarre when President Lyndon Johnson sent federal troops and tanks to Detroit, and the two settings merged within the surreal world of television. Thank you.
Well, I'll try to use this thing. Beware of the person with short nose. I have a different approach to take in terms of the experiences that I've been through over the last 50 years. That approach is trying to develop strategy and tactics that are absolutely opposed to what the capitalist system has provided. Let me give you an example. The Kerner report is continuously quoted for institutional racism. It's not institutional racism, it's capitalist racism. Capitalism is what is oppressing the working class in this country, and in particular the black community. I don't want to embarrass people, but I want to ask a very simple question. Because I believe that the concentration of wealth in this country is the thing that we must address. But we can't address it and mobilize people simply on the question of the concentration of wealth. Obviously, police brutality will always be a focus as long as we provide an analysis relative to that focus. So, I'm not trying to embarrass people. How many people have heard of the Scottsboro Boys? Now be honest. Wonderful.
Scottsboro Boys.
Scottsboro Boys. Oh. All right. 1931. 7 young men, boys really, were accused of rape in Alabama. And Ron Scott was in my office for about 11 years because I housed the Coalition Against Police Brutality. And Ron Scott and I had a discussion about what the Scottsboro Boys represented, because there was a national mobilization to get these young men found innocent. They were tried for rape, found guilty, appeals occurred, The two women who accused them recanted. It was a battle that went on for about 7 years, well, no longer than that, at least 10 years. So Ron Scott and I discussed how would we present this. And what we came up with was there was a white sheriff in the city where they were accused. There were thousands of a lynch mob that wanted to lynch him to eliminate the question of a trial. That white sheriff prevented the lynching. Why would that be important? Because what we have to do as a movement, and I include you all in the movement, we have to unite the working class. We have to bring people together to fight against police brutality, to fight against the kind of oppression that the people are against. There's a long history of the fight against police brutality. People don't realize Damon Keith organized an organization against police brutality in the late 40s. Ron Scott organized the Coalition Against Police Brutality after the Malice Green murder. And then the two officers were found not guilty. He was in our office from about I'm still in 2003 till about 2004. Now the importance of that, the fact that he was in our office, arises because we were on the 8th floor. So while most coalitions are on storefronts, they couldn't be attacked. He was able to function without police attack for 11 years because they couldn't come up to the 8th floor and try to attack as they would if he was in a storefront. So he was successful in a number of ways. And we can list the people who were murdered by the police. I made a list here, but I just had eye surgery and I can't read the small print anymore. But one of the persons I want to mention is Guilford. He's a young white kid who was murdered in Eaton Rapids, Michigan. And he was murdered by the Copper Coast. And had Ron Scott been alive, Ron Scott would have gone there and helped to mobilize opposition to that kind of a murder. And why is that important? Because ultimately, the fight against police brutality is a fight against militarization of the police. And Black Lives Matter is important not just for black lives, but for all militarization of the police. And that's how we can build a movement, because we build a movement to unite the class. And it's the Kerner report talking about institutional racism did that on purpose. They did it so you won't talk about capitalism. You won't talk about how workers are being oppressed in this country. I represented James Johnson. I filed a lawsuit against Chrysler Corporation. Well, I better tell you who James Johnson is. Yeah, James Johnson is a young black man who walked into the Chrysler plant at Eldon Avenue and shot and killed two foremen and a job setter. And Kenny Cockrell and Chuck Ravitz represented him, and he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. And I filed a lawsuit for workers' comp saying he didn't pull that trigger. Chrysler Corporation pulled that trigger. And Chrysler was found guilty and had to pay him for what he did. Now, I've never met a person who didn't have an opinion about that case. Everybody has an opinion. You know, there's obviously a number of people who said a murderer got paid and Chrysler had to do it, but there's a whole huge number of people who unite with what James Johnson did. And Mitch, who's sitting over there, is able to recount the poem that was written and distributed all over the city. I couldn't do it, so what I did, I don't have that kind of memory. So what I did is I printed it and put it in my office, and so it hangs there in my office, and Mitch can tell you it's a great poem. James Johnson should have had a Thompson. But the importance of it is that it addresses the question of worker oppression. And workers came to me and said, I put a note on the bulletin board, Foreman James, I'm going to get you and I'm going to get paid for it. And what happened for workers in the entire Wayne County area, there was a reduction of oppression. Foremen were less willing to just mistreat people. And why is that? Because it was a fight against the capitalist oppression of workers, and it was white workers and black workers who were fighting against that. And that's the kind of thing that we have to do as a movement. We have to build an analysis that can unite people, and it isn't simply based on race. It has to be based upon the fact that workers in this country are being messed over by a militarized police force that cares nothing about protecting anybody. And for that, and that's a reason for a political analysis that can begin to unite people and not divide them. Obviously, the ruling class in this country has an agenda to divide people. Divide people based on race, divide people based on gender, divide people based upon sexual preference. And if there's any time that we must unite the class, is right now. Because Donald Trump is organizing brown shirts in a fascist movement to continue to oppress people in this country. And the way in which we use words is very important. We cannot unite with the way in which the corporate media analyzes what's going on. Let me give you an example. Profiling. There's no such thing as profiling. That sounds like a mathematical analysis. It's targeting. They're targeting people to kill, and they're targeting communities to punish. And so when the corporate media says, oh, there's profiling, it's bullshit. It's not profiling. It's targeting people for murder. Another example, diversity. We want diversity. Well, no, we don't want diversity. We want people who support the working class. And there are plenty of people who are black who don't. Obviously, Clarence Thomas is a good example. But I'm an attorney, and I go in front of judges all the time. And there's good black judges, but there's plenty of them who have pulled the ladder up and do not care about the people who come in front of them. And that's black women, black women judges, black male judges, and Latino judges. There's also some good white judges. So what we have to do is fight for a perspective that will in fact unite the class. And therefore what we have to do is to be vigilant in terms of the words that are used, in terms of the words that describe what's happening to us. Because it isn't simply the brutality against the race, it's the brutality against everybody in this country. I'll just tell this story. I was going to represent a person in a Social Security case, a disabled person. So you have to go through this whole thing about, them searching you. Now, I'll admit that my anger gets short with that because I don't think it has anything to do with security. It has to do with regimentation. They want everybody to get used to being searched, being humiliated, being mistreated. So I was in a hurry because I wanted to get upstairs and talk to my client, and this was over at the Pat McNamara building on Michigan and Cass. So I didn't take off my watch. So I go through, and he said, no, you got to go back through. So I take off my watch. Then I go through, and I had something else. So then the guy says, okay, stand over there. Put your arms out. And so I do that. And he then wands me, and I don't have anything. So I turned to sit down. He said, I didn't tell you to sit down. Stand there and put your arms up. So he wands me again. And so he didn't find anything. So it's kind of an automatic response. I turned. He said, I told you not to turn again. And so he wands me again, and I still didn't find anything. So then he said, sit down. So I said, yes, sir. No, sir. So at that point, I'm sitting there and sitting there. And they can't figure out a way to make me leave the building because I don't have any reason to leave the building. I'm an attorney. I have to represent this guy. And so they bring down this tall, white sergeant or something. And so I'm still saying, look, I got to go to Social Security, you know, and I see a guy from Social Security. I put up my hand to say, I'll be there. This tall, white sergeant throws me against the wall. He grabs me, and I say, what are you going to do now, beat me up? And so he cuffs me, takes me downstairs, and then he calls upstairs and he says, well, I'm going to charge him with resistance. And somebody, they had films of this. So he said, well, I can charge him with disorder. So he charges me with disorder. Rick Martin, who was former president, obviously, of the Coke ovens, and is now a lawyer, represented me, and we demanded a copy of the films, and the case has never been prosecuted since. I don't know what happened to the case, but at that time I was 70 years old, so I guess they decided not to do anything. I haven't asked. But that's the point. You see the point I'm trying to make? They don't give a damn what color you are. They want you to bow down to them, and they want every worker to bow down to them. And it's not about training, because you can train these guys till hell freezes over, and they are going to continue to brutalize the working class. It's about political perspective, and that's what we have to bring to our intelligence. We have to continuously think about how we are going to make our movement grow, how we are going to unite people, how we are going to make our movement such that every person is a militant person in opposition, not only to police brutality, but to exploitation, to oppression of all kinds. That's where I'm coming from, and that's what I want to convey to this group right now. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, we're going to take questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free, just raise your hand, and Craig will be the roaming reporter.
I just had a question for all three of you about what do you think police brutality is like right now. A friend of mine, he was at the Detroit fireworks maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and he's a white guy, and they're watching this white guy with dreadlocks getting beaten up. So there was a guy who was playing drums, and he was told to move by the police, and the guy who was playing drums didn't want to move, and the police started beating him up. And then my friend and a couple of other friends were like filmed it with their phones. And then the police took their phones and then smashed them and said, you know, you guys take this shit too seriously. And so what do you think not like comparing police now to then, but also like how can we be proactive about trying to work towards the situation?
Well, I sort of feel like, you know, you guys can tell me what you think and everyone else too, but I feel like there's a straight line between what happened in the past and what's happened today. And because of the acquittals at places like the Algiers and prior to that, and then what happened with stress, I mean, there was resistance to it, but because there was this long history of impunity for the police, there's continued impunity for the police. And there's continued impunity for the officials that cover up police behavior that is at best unethical and at worst unconstitutional. So I feel like there's a straight line. I think that people need to stand behind Black Lives Matter. I think they need to be part of community efforts to oppose police brutality. I think people need to demand citizen oversight of police officers and their institutions. And so I think we all need to be part of that, because that shouldn't happen anywhere. And the thing is that people who are largely not affected by that, people like me, like suburban white ladies who are educated, and like, we need to be at the middle of that, right? Demanding that that doesn't happen, because a lot of times people in my community look around and they feel like, the police are here to protect us from them. But as long as the police are brutalizing anybody, they're a threat to democracy.
Pass it down, we want to give it a shot. I just wanted to kind of give one parallel between yesterday and today. As a lot of people had mentioned during their talks, that Detroit was considered in many ways to be a model city. You had more black homeowners here than anywhere, highest wages in the country, and this was thought to be, at least by the white people that were running the city at the time, the one place that wouldn't rebel. And I think you have a similar kind of PR pitch afoot now amongst the quote-unquote new Detroit of Gilbertville. And I think you see a lot of parallels in the sense that because there are areas being carved out, there's a lot of racialized capitalism, as Ron was alluding to, polices those boundaries very carefully. So there was recently a shooting at the fireworks, for example, and now that whole area is not only surveilled by the Detroit police, but by private police, Dan Gilbert's private police and surveillance firms. And so I think what you're going to see is on these boundaries of places where capital seeks to go and exploit land and resources, there's going to be tension as they work to move poor people out of the city. And I think we've seen that already. It might not make the news to the degree that it has in other places, but I think that's actively underfoot now. And those same kind of tensions that existed in the 60s Detroit are prevalent today, especially the policing of the waterfront, for example. If you go down there and just see the ways in which police keep an eye on young black men in particular, black women as well, though, you see kind of those kind of boundary type tensions emerging in the city as it is right now.
And how many police forces are actively patrolling in Detroit? Because there's like 6 or 7.
This is a good point too about Midtown, and this is not something that's unique to Detroit. It's every gentrifying city. If you go to Cleveland, if you go to like Case Western in Cleveland, there'll be 4 different police units that have jurisdiction in that area. Like, I'll give you an example. I was at a conference to see my friend Ronald Williams, and I was with my friend Dan, who's black, and we were walking on a building on campus. I mean, we look innocuous as hell. I mean, we've got book bags and like computers and shit, and we got rolled up by like it wasn't even a university police, it was some other body that had jurisdiction there, rolled up and asked what we were doing. We were like, what are we doing? We're on a campus going to a room. Fuck do you mean, what are we doing? But we see the over-policing, particularly of this area. Wayne's police is all over this area, well beyond the boundaries of the campus, So you see those resources being diverted from the poorest communities that actually need those resources and moved over here. So it ties again directly into kind of what Ron was saying. Pass the mic.
Now, I was just wanted to bring attention to the fact that, the city's still basically being run by the governor's office. And since we've been disenfranchised, that's allowed all manner of madness to be put in place, right? And so what we used to have, when we elected our officials, we had oversight over the police, those kinds of circumstances in Detroit. Because actually, relatively speaking, in the last decade or so, Detroit has not seen some of those horrific situations across the country. That was because there were certain agencies in place. They're gone.
Ron Scott too.
Ron Scott, his work, all of that. I mean, that's gone now. So unfortunately, I think you're going to see more of that. That's my sad opinion about what's happening. And what's happening, I think, at Davis Creek, you got to think about it nationally, because now they're calling the shots. Gilbertville, the Lord. The Lord.
Well, Ron Scott and I used to talk about this quite a bit, and I think what they're trying to do is run poor people out of Detroit. The suburbs like Warren and a number of those suburbs are falling apart, Southfield. So they want to, and Detroit is prime property. It's got the water, it's just a wonderful place. And my view is that, the white ruling class says, damn, why did we give it up? Get the hell out of here so we can rebuild it. And so what they're doing, and a good friend of mine, her son was murdered, and the first thing she thought of is moving out of Detroit. She really wasn't able to. She owned the house, etc. But that's the first thing that came to her mind. So what we do, I live in Detroit, and what we have to do is, just like I said, we have to build a movement. Without a movement, they can do any damn thing they want to. With a movement, they then are balanced. But the movement has to have a perspective that will then promote unity, promote a way in which we can fight together. And that is a political perspective. Now let me just say one thing that's very controversial, and I don't know how many people are going to agree with it, but I'm going to say it because it might help to understand why I'm coming from this position. I believe in reparations. I believe there should be reparations paid, but the reparations should pay all people who make under $200,000 a year. Now, the first answer is, well, damn it. Black people who want to suffer slavery, why is everybody else going to participate in reparations? Well, we've been fighting for reparations for 50 years, and we haven't got off first base. But if we develop a strategy that will demand that everybody under $200,000 gets paid for reparations, we might be able to build a movement around that. And that's what I mean by strategy and tactics. Our strategy and tactics always has to be in that context. And I know it's a hard pill to swallow because we had slavery, we had gym segregation, we had mass incarceration. For God's sakes, that should be enough for reparations. We shouldn't have to say, let's share. But the fact is, we've lost on those positions, so damn it, let's try another strategy. That's my position.
Great. I wonder if would it be okay if we took a few questions and then go back, like 3 or 4 comments, and then maybe go back? Does that make sense? I'm sure there's a few hands. I don't know who is next. Over here. We'll get 3 or 4 in, and then we'll go back.
Okay. Well, my question is more, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Ron.
All right, Ron, I have oh dear. Sorry. So my question is more in regards to, I know in regards to in your speech and like what you were saying in the previous comment, like I know you seem to be having a very rather anti-capitalist view on how, in regards to capitalism, it seems to affect a lot of people more, affect basically everybody in the working class on a more equal plane. But I'm kind of wondering.
No, not on an equal plane.
I'm sorry, what?
Well,
I mean, on the working, I'm saying like affecting, working class
but
people.
most oppressively against the national minorities. That's how capitalism functions.
I guess my main question is, especially even though capitalism affects the working class, affects mainly the working class, and particularly with your anecdote about how this sort of, with the militarization of police, like wouldn't also like your privilege necessarily being, let's say like as a white male, wouldn't also affect you in that instance as well? Like my main question is, I guess like I know you kind of mentioned like capitalism more like as a sort of, I guess I think in certain respects like the working class like being together, but like when working class, but wouldn't that be a bit more like nuanced in the sense that wouldn't people of color necessarily in the working class be more marginalized and more affected by this, and just white people, and that more this militarization is affecting people of color, maybe the working class even more?
Of course. capitalism always oppresses, particularly in this country, national minorities in a much more explicit way, in a much more violent way. The purpose of that is to divide the class. The purpose of that is to tell the white worker, well, you're not going to suffer this. This is what we do to the national minorities because they are what they are. They're inferior, they're violent, they're criminal. They make up a lot of words. Do you realize that, well, see, that's the advantage of being old. And I am old. Do you realize that they used to take the position that black people couldn't play basketball? Believe that. I mean, racism changes its perspective every time it can. You know, they've lost that one, so they just change it and make up another one. But the purpose is for us to find ways in which we can communicate to as many workers as possible that we're in this fight together. We have to fight together if we're ever going to get rid of these people. And the reason I focus on capitalism is because that's what we have in this country. We have a ruling class that owns the country. That's why the first thing I said is the most important issue facing us is the concentration of wealth in the most backward sections of the ruling class, including Donald Trump, the Koch brothers, etc. So, but we can't mobilize people around that issue because people aren't directly affected. So we mobilize people on the question of oppression by the police. But I still say we have to always be conscious of what the system is that is doing that to us.
So this is not a new discussion, and I want to encourage other voices to come into this. So you may have other comments, but I feel like this is a conversation that we can broaden beyond just going back and forth with Ron, because I know there are people in the room who have other comments on this too. I don't know whose hand was up next. Go ahead. We're not going to get the order exactly right, so... Go ahead. Okay.
I guess I have a real simple question. I don't own a TV, haven't owned a TV in over 8 years. But unfortunately, it's hard to, with social media, and I watch sports from time to time, I catch a commercial or two in the news. But the broad spectrum is brought about being said that violence is more prevalent or being more dangerous in the black communities. And in my studies and my understanding, there's no more violent person than the white man who's brought more violence across the world. And unfortunately, they control the media. So every day when I do catch the news, or I do catch a Facebook or a YouTube or an Instagram post, it's always a black violence or a black crime. How do we change the image or the idea that the black man or the black community is the most violent and has always been the most violent community or the most violent man on this planet, when in reality, the white man is? No other race of man has taken on more wars or brought more violence to more people than the white man, than anybody else. But unfortunately, every day, it's people that look like me, a brown complexion, a brown looks, whether it be black, Latino, or any other race, that's being portrayed as being violent. But it's not being said that the most violent person from day one has been the white man. How do we change that view through media and social media and let it be known that we are not the violence and we are not the people that are more prone to promote this violence? We can't finance this violence. Like I said, there's AK-47s in Highland Park, Michigan. I'm from Highland Park, Michigan. I have no idea how they get there. I watched a program the other day where they said that guns are being sold in Detroit at an alarming rate and resold. And I'm wondering, how did they come in our communities? So how do we put that message out there that the violence that is in our community is not brought to, it's not us, it's being brought to us, and change that through not only just the media, but through the social aspect also?
Oh, I don't really have an answer to that, but on a related tip, which I think is even more bizarre, is that they will show you the violence, like the white policeman shooting, killing, and beating and no one seems to process that in terms of that is the point of the violence. There's something about the whole social educational conditioning in this country which has predisposed our thinking into almost inverting what we're seeing and placing blame on the victim. Now that's even more bizarre to me, because I think you do see white violence, but then you blame the victim rather than looking at who's actually the perpetrator.
I mean,
You know what I'm saying? So that's,
a young lady texted a guy and told him to commit suicide and she goes to jail, and an officer shoots a man 7 times with a woman and a child in the back seat, and he doesn't go to jail. I mean, I'm not trying to say that she's had any fault, but I mean, a text message deserves prison, and an officer shooting a guy 7 times doesn't.
There's no question that there's unfairness, oppression, etc. My answer is leadership, black leadership that unites the class. That we have to fight to build leadership that unites the class and does not divide the class. And that's why I talked about reparations. I talked about different perspectives in terms of analysis. So if we build that kind of leadership, and Martin Luther King is the perfect example, then we can, I think, build a movement. But it is ultimately black leadership.
But,
Mitch,
oh.
go ahead.
Can I just add to that? I would just say, you know, part of what you were saying is that we're conditioned to see white violence and then blame the victim. So I think in addition to that, there needs to be a re-education of white people, right? So that
That's going to have to happen from that.
Right, when we see that, we need to be like, that cop is the violent one, like, not to assume that the black man. This is like that racial conditioning is everywhere. It's like we're all swimming in it, we're all covered with it, we're wet with those stereotypes and that racism and that white supremacy. And until we can like see it and like see it all over us and try to get it off of us and re-see it in the way that it really is, then I don't think it will. Does that make any sense? Then I'm not sure it will change. But I feel like there needs to be re-education in the white community too.
I mean, yeah, because
Yeah, but the corporate media doesn't want that.
No.
We have a comment here,
Mitch?
and then we have Baxter over here. Who else had their hand up? I want to get a little community queue going. 1, 2, who's 3? 3? Okay, go ahead.
All right, I didn't have a question, I had a comment more or less. Going back, looking at the time of the rebellion in '67, Detroit was one of the most racist, segregated cities on earth, The things, the brutality that the police department put on black people was like an army that came in to wage war on the inhabitants, If you didn't live it, then you couldn't feel it, but it was when we see the violence of the police today on TV, we see it around the world. It's been going on for decades and decades on the streets, all through Detroit, for decades, no different. We used to get stopped, frisked, for any reason, at any time. If we were standing still, the police would ride up and say, "Give me that corner." And everybody had to walk on down the street somewhere and pretend like they were doing something that they wasn't really doing. But the police didn't want to stand there. I remember as a high school student, I got out of high school in '65, and they had cops there they called the Big Four. 4 cops that rode together, and one of them, they patrolled the same area, so you knew them, by sight and something by name. They had a guy called Rotation Slim. If he didn't like you, he'd just get out the car and start kicking your ass. You didn't have to be doing nothing. That's just the way, that we were seeing. My parents came here, came up this way from the South Carolina, so on and so forth, in the 40s, early 50s, trying to escape racism and have a little better way of life for themselves. Well, they kind of got a little better way of life for themselves, but they came nowhere close to escaping no racism. Whatever they faced down there, they faced it right up there. And it just didn't manifest itself with the police, employment, jobs. Blacks were the last hired, the first fired. I got out of school in '65. The industrialization in Detroit was booming. Plants were hiring. Maybe me and 6 or 8 of my friends would go to Chrysler to get a job. There might be 2 white guys. They get the job, but we didn't. You know, it was just impossible. It's just incredible the things I've seen. They had a city, Ronald, Warren. If you got a job out that way, you had to be out of Warren before it got dark. Else you gonna get that ass whooped, you know, by the police in Warren. The racism was everywhere in the houses. We couldn't stay in certain places. You know what I'm talking about? It seems like today, we're just about going right on back that way. If you go to any black area in the city, and ask any black person what's happening, they're gonna tell you, well, it fixes up certain areas for white people. Because as black, that's what we see. Certain areas of white people, they're gonna have a nice life in these areas. While we're gonna look at burned out houses, you know, talking about dilapidated buildings, no jobs and poverty. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know really how much has changed from now to then. But at that time, the rebellion, blacks had plenty to rebel about, and they did, and they had plenty of reasons. I stayed for a while. I think the first place I remember staying was on Canfield, between Woodward and John R. They had a police station next door, and all through the night, many times, you hear blacks being beaten in that precinct. That was a popular area at the time. They used to call it Paradise Valley. And a lot of black entertainers and things would be down there entertaining people down there for a good time. And the police were so brutal to blacks at that time, it was just absurd. But I just wanted to say that it was police, yes, they gave you something you could feel, but it was the whole culture of racism that consumed Detroit on every front. The foods we ate at that time were brought to us by markets that sold rotten meat and, you know, old products and stuff. We were just not equally a citizen, you know, in the city of Detroit. We were not treated like a citizen in the city of Detroit. And it's shit almost true today. But thank you.
My name is
Right, yeah, I don't know how to use it, I just walk near it and it turns on.
Maybe a range,
I'll stand
Walk
here.
near it, it might
maybe a
turn right on.
range issue that the Bluetooth. Okay, stand
That's fascinating. Okay, thank you for being an antenna. I remember, I gotta say this, we used to have those rabbit ear antennas, and we just change them, and the TV station go out, and somebody have to go there and hold it. and then you put some aluminum foil.
Yeah.
You remember that?
They don't remember that.
Anyway, the gentleman here that just spoke is right. I wasn't here for the first part of your presentation, but what happened in '67 was a boiling over point. And it can happen in 2017 or any year when people have had enough of something. In the black community, police were always looked upon as a military outfit with badges, uniforms, billy clubs, firearms, and permission to beat the hell out of you with no accountability. The only difference today, and this is mostly for you young people, we didn't have Facebook.
We didn't even have cell phones. If something happened, it was isolated. And you just didn't know about it, but it was happening. I don't really see a difference. I'm gonna be honest with you. I know he doesn't see a difference. I don't see a difference. What comes to my mind, and it makes me tear up every time I see this. Sometimes you watch if you watch television, you'll see a commercial about a dog. A dog. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't care about dogs. But this white supremacist, and I'm gonna call it like it is, controlled system cares more about animals than it does about black people. And I challenge anybody to tell me different. I remember a time when nobody really said white people. They said Germans, Italians, Polish people. Then all of a sudden, it was white people. And then we became a minority. So that whole word was invented. And all this stuff is invented just to keep this system of power alive. Now, I know you got capitalism and all these fancy words about how the system of monetary. This is not about that. Because it's all over the world. Dark people all over the world are valued less than lighter skinned people. Let's call it like it is. In Australia, you have the Aborigines. Who are they? Darker skinned people. So, I tell people this, and this is important. You are born in this life with a purpose, and then you die. When you die, you're not going to have a skin color. It's gone. All you're going to have is your spirit. That's all you're going to have. Really think about the things that you value. And I know some of you around here, young, and you got long, luxurious, beautiful hair. But guess what? That's going to be gone. That's going to be gone. Think about the things that you value. What is important? Once we start doing this, then we can do away with the problem. We'll do away with the problem. Otherwise, like history said, it's going to continue to repeat itself. So, that's what I wanted to say. I hope it didn't cause too much confusion with here. I appreciate the education. About 67, somebody asked me, what do you think? They said, Baba, do you think it was a riot? Do you think it was a rebellion? Do you think it was an uprising? I told him it was all of those and more. You had all of that and more going on. But as far as the police is concerned, we need to change that whole system. Because that oath that they take about protecting and serving, you might well throw that out the window. That's just another, we call it hypocrisy. So I know other people got to talk. So thank you very much. What we want to say.
To respect the time, I'm going to suggest this gentleman here, and then there was a woman back here who wanted to speak, and then David, we go back for final comments.
Sure.
And then there'll be an opportunity to mill about a little bit afterwards, so thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to be brief. Y'all dealt with two things, the police, and Glotta tried to deal with capitalism. The black thing is becoming so important once again as it always has been. They used to say, when the white man catches a cold, the black man has pneumonia. Because that's how this society has always treated us. I can tell you a horror story. Because I was here in 67. I was an adult in 67. And I can go back to the 50s when the police, when I was 10 years old, the police slapped me upside the head and say, "Little Negro," that's not the word they use. When we tell you to do something, you do it. When they broke into our house, and asked me if they have a search warrant. But what I want to say about the black thing, there's nothing in this country that has ever happened progressive that did not involve black leadership, strong black leadership. You can't get away from that. Because let me offer a little suggestion. Let me offer a comment, because I don't have time to really explain what I want to explain, so I'm trying to make a comment, especially about what Glotta said about capitalism. I don't even know what to call it anymore. Because of the digital revolution, the robots and the computers, unemployment and employment is not the same anymore. It's been said that a robot replaces, depending on the industry, 6 people, 1 out of 6 people. That's going to get greater. It's also been said, and they've done some statistics, in the next 10 years, 20% of these high school graduates will be needed for employment. What happens to the other 80%? Not only is that other percent partly white, but we're always at the bottom. And for the first time, I want to sort of give you some food for thought, especially you young people. For the first time in American history, because of the digital and robotic revolution, they don't need black people anymore. They had to have us as slaves. They had to. They had to use us during World War II. They had to use us during the middle 60s and 70s for all of these factories. They don't need us anymore. That 20% that graduates from high school, they're going to get the cream of the crop. That cream of the crop is not going to be black. So once again, this is another reason for them to just get rid of us. Either we kill ourselves or they'll kill us. It doesn't matter to them. This police brutality thing, they done had police boards and all kinds of stuff. But let me offer again some food for thought. What we're living in now is a corporate state. There is nowhere, I don't want to call it capitalism because I don't want to get into that. But we're living in a corporate state. There's nowhere that you can turn that the corporation is not running and telling you what to do. Everybody, they're contract workers, which means they don't have any pensions, they don't have any benefits. Everything is for the corporate state. And one of the things that Malcolm X used to talk about is history is the best barometer of how to look at and how to challenge us and to provoke our studies. And what I mean by that is taking a page from Martin Luther King. One of the reasons why he was successful is because he made this white man adhere to his own constitution. It was written way back in the 1700s or something. And I'm gonna get to the police thing. One of the problems with the police force is they have made the police force an appendage of the insurance company, the car insurance company. That's part of the corporate state. There's no such thing as, oh, driving is a privilege. No, I have a right to go pick up my wife if she works in Birmingham. I have a right to go pick up my child, they going to school in Warren. I have a right. Nobody even uses the term inalienable rights anymore. And what Glotta was talking about profiling, we need to profile and target, because you young people are going to have to do this. You need to profile and target some of these politicians and make them change the laws. For example, just for example, one day I'm driving and my lights are not on. The police pulled beside me and said, your lights are not on. I cut him on. He went by his way, I went by my way. By contrast, here's a police officer, everybody saw it on the news. He stopped a man because he has a broken tail light. And it results in murder. It results in a man, the police should not have the right to do that. They're doing it because it's part of their mandate, it's part of the insurance corporation. And so this no-fault thing, then people should be put in prison for writing that no-fault law. Have you ever heard the police say, part of the problem that we're having, even with our own police force, is because of the no-fault law, people can't afford insurance. You're supposed to be a criminal now because you can't afford car insurance? 40% of the black folk in Detroit are on paper. They're on probation, you're a lawyer. They're on probation or they're on parole. Part of the problem is car insurance. How do you get to work if the man tells you you need $2,000 a month for car insurance? And you got people in Bloomfield driving Jaguars and pay $500. You understand what I'm saying? So I'm just giving you perspective. Your movement has to be directed against the corporate state. I'm not telling you how to do that, but you need to profile and target. Target some of these politicians. Target some of these people. And that's all I want to say, because I can really go on and on.
We have one more comment back here, and then we'll kick it up to the panel for final thoughts.
I have a question. Over the 67 rebellion anniversary, there's been a lot of videos coming up. And what I've seen, and I wanted to know what your guys' impression of, how the white community, how some of the white community members were involved in the rebellion. You don't see that too much, but going back looking at some of those videos, with people lined up against the walls, you'll see some white people being lined up, some white people being arrested, and I think why this is a rebellion is because not only did black people rise up, but some of the white people that were feeling oppressed by the police also rose up. I just want to know if you guys had any opinion on that or had any more to offer.
I'd love to comment on that. That's a very good question, and it's, a misnomer is that 1967 was a race riot. It wasn't when they used the term riot, but race had nothing to do with it. It was people rebelling against state institutions or institutions associated with exploitation, furniture lenders, pawnbrokers, what have you. But white people constituted 12% of all those arrested. Which is significant, and based on the racist nature of the police, that means that far more than 12% of the people involved were white people. They just happened to be 12% of the people that were arrested. Now, beyond that, too, we oftentimes forget, because if you grew up later, you think of Detroit as Black City, Chocolate City, vanilla suburbs, but there were very poor communities in Detroit along 4th Street and others that used to catch hell from the police, the so-called hillbillies, right? And their relationship with the DPD was not much better than the black communities. And in fact, when there were reports of sniping some of the people that were arrested for sniping were some of those hillbillies trying to get some retribution for the hell they had to pay at the hands of the Big Four, right? Those are people that were raised with guns and they were ready to use them, you know? So, you know, that's kind of the kind of how the rebellion itself has been mystified, right? And as it's been remembered and told by people that weren't even near it, right? And it's a way that they can kind of tell themselves that this narrative was, that this was race and we were under attack, and then they can excuse themselves for leaving Detroit and leaving poor people with the bill. You know, so, you know, that's a very important point that needs to be talked about. And as people remember this, right, that point has to be stressed, right? The way that white people have manipulated this history, right, to excuse their own behaviors, which have created the inequities that created the rebellion. And will create another one. I would just argue, Mitch was talking about before, you know, he sees no difference in the police and the relationship with the community, and I would agree with that. I would say that because of the way that it's going now, though, the fire next time is more likely to be in the inner ring suburbs than it is to, like in Ferguson, for example. There's no surprise that that happened outside of St. Louis rather than in St. Louis. And I think the staunch nature of segregation here will bear that out. But believe me, I think all signs are pointing to very similar material conditions than those that led to 1967. And despite what they tell you about the city's comeback and how well Dan Gilbert's doing, don't be surprised when it happens.
I really am talking about.
Well, I'm not afraid to use the word capitalism, and I will continue to use it. I did commentaries for the Coalition Against Police Brutality for 5 years, and I have CDs of all those commentaries if people want them. But the one thing we have to remember is the black community has moral power and political power, and they can use it. Moral power earned through slavery, segregation, Jim Crow segregation, and mass incorporation. And they have political power. There's black leadership in this country that can move things. They have to be forced to move things. They have to be forced to take political positions that represent the working class, which is the constituency that elected them. So that's how we build a movement. And the movement, I don't mind the word corporate state. That's a capitalist state. I'll unite with that in a minute. But the point is that we have to build a movement that will unite the working class, and we can do that through black leadership. But we have to force that black leadership not to pull up the ladder once they get power, but in fact be representative of the entire class.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming out. I think we got to close up. Oh, what? Well, I thought she was doing like sign language for me. I had no idea what the fuck was going on. Lonzo, I actually wanted to ask you a favor. I wanted to see if you might be able to come next week. Next week from 6 to 8, we have a program that's called, I cheekily titled it Capital Punishment.
Called what?
Capital Punishment.
Oh, capital punishment.
And it's deindustrialization, automation, and the end of the line. So I was hoping you could talk about some of your experiences in the factories in the 70s and 80s.
Here?
Yeah. Would you be willing to do it? There we go. I got one. Put him on the spot. There we go. So please, all of you, if you could come out, I want to give you a little preview to the event. One of the speakers is going to be Austin McCoy, who's been working on a dissertation on Detroit and deindustrialization. He's done a lot with DARE, which was Kennedy's organization in 1979. He's doing a wonderful study. And Jerry Goldberg as well, who had been organizing on the left against automation during the 70s and 80s as well. So, and Lonzo was involved in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and leftist struggle for years. So we're going to have a great rousing talk of people that actually lived it, as well as somebody that studied it, and hopefully that cross-generational dialogue will bear some fruit and help Austin with this study. That's what I'm hoping. So we hope to see you all there, and we thank you guys for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.